Good evening, everybody. What a pleasure to see you here, and what a pleasure to see a sold-out house for Franklin Foer coming to talk at the John Adams Institute about his book, The Last Politician. And of course, the main word of welcome is for our guest of honor himself. Welcome. And you are not the first of your family to be here. Oh, before I forget, my name is Tracy Metz. I'm the director of the John Adams. You were not the first of your family to come. Actually, you're almost the last, Franklin. We have had your brother Jonathan, I think, 3 times at the John Adams. Your other brother Joshua has also been here. And even during COVID, I had an online interview with your mother. So I'm delighted that we've managed to close the circle and bring the family back here together. So, why are we here? Well, we know why we're here, because this is an incredibly important year in the history of the United States, I think in the history of the world, in current affairs. This is real stuff, and it's big. And that's why I'm so glad that Franklin has written the biography of Joe Biden, The Last Politician. I think we're all really looking forward to hearing more from him about what drives Biden. He is an important president at an important moment of time. And of course, in November, we'll know more about what that has meant and may mean in the future. No, none of us have a crystal ball. What are Joe Biden's hopes and fears? His hopes are, I think we all know that. We see that he is a good and dedicated person, and his hopes are for the good of the nation. He also has fears. Will Joe Scranton, as I know Franklin calls him, will Joe Scranton ever measure up? Is it good enough? Well, we don't know, but there's a big story to behold here. And I hope that you will listen carefully and have lots of questions for him. We have time for the Q&A. He'll give a talk first, and then have a conversation with our moderator, Elko Bos van Rosenthal, and then there will be time for questions from you. Then I'll come back with a few closing words, and Franklin will go to the book stand out front to sign for you, and I'm sure there'll be a long line and probably still lots of questions, because you ain't seen the last of this yet. May I give the floor to Franklin Foer.
I was loving the John Adams Institute until I heard that I was the last member of my family invited. By birth order, I am the oldest, and so I'm just now, in the spirit of Joe Biden, seething with all sorts of resentment at the fact that it took so long. First, I wanted to just say it's really an important thing for a political journalist to occasionally leave their country to discuss their politics with people from another place, from another continent. And one of the things that's been so profoundly actually moving, touching to me coming here is just seeing the interest that you have in the fate of the United States. And there have been various moments as I've had conversations about politics with some of you where I've thought, wow, I wish my fellow citizens felt the same level of concern about American democracy and about the fate of this next election that you seem to have here. So thank you for expressing concern for us. I don't know if we're going to be all right in the end. I don't know if you're going to be all right in the end. But I want to just talk a little bit about Joe Biden as a subject and how I ended up here. One question somebody asked me yesterday at an event was, would you have written a book about Barack Obama? And I think the answer was probably I would not have written a book about Barack Obama, because as a literary character, first of all, Barack Obama writes incredible books about himself. But secondly, as a literary character, Barack Obama, there's a little bit of this quality of a deity that he has. There's an inaccessibility that I've always found when I've thought about Barack Obama. Perhaps that's the curse of being an incredible orator, is that when you speak in poetry, there's a distance that it creates between you and everybody else. But Joe Biden, the thing that I found unattractive about him, and then ultimately very attractive about him, was the way in which, as a literary character, not as a political figure, he was so accessible in a way. That the thing about Joe Biden, and I've told the story before, it was the first time I met him when I was 24 years old. I was a cub reporter. I got him on the phone, and the guy just wouldn't shut up. And it was like story after story about being in the Senate when he was 28 years old, and all of his Irish family. And at first, that bothered me about Joe Biden, and I had almost a snobbish reaction to the man. That the way that he talks, he doesn't talk like somebody like Barack Obama, who went to an Ivy League schools and has this kind of professorial command of the world. Joe Biden is somebody who speaks in homespun aphorisms. He speaks in cliches. He's the quintessential politician, thus the title of my book. But I ultimately found that the thing that was interesting to me about him was that he wears so much of himself on his sleeve. You can see that he's insecure about his place in the world, in part because of the way that he talks, the way that he's always trying to make you love him. That's why he tells these stories at such incredible length. That's why he's able to express the kind of empathy that he's able to express to other human beings. When you're with him, it feels like he's trying to reach across the table and grab you by the lapel and say, "Love me, goddammit." And so he's also had these ambitions, that he's somebody who has pursued the presidency multiple times. And when he ultimately became president in 2020, nobody expected that this was going to be the case. Everybody thought that he was too old, that he was past his prime, that he'd had his moments and the moments had passed him by. And so the fact that he has these ambitions that are just so palpable and you can sink your teeth into them as a writer. And it's fascinating to me that as president of the United States, at the age of 80, he still is insecure about the way that people think about him in the world, that he's always been somebody who's talked about the fact that unlike Obama, unlike Clinton, he went to a state school. He's very much brands himself as a child of the working class. The defining moment in his life as a kid was when his father lost his job, and that his family, which had been quite prosperous, experienced a social slide. And these things stuck with him. And then when he ran for president in the 1980s, he was accused of plagiarizing a speech from a Labor Party politician, Neil Kinnock. And that accusation of plagiarism to him made it sound like everybody thought that he was stupid. Everybody thought that he was plastic, that when he gave a speech, he was always reciting somebody else's lines. And in fact, one of the things that's so interesting about him as president is that one of the fundamental parts of the job of being president is obviously communication. And the thing we know about Joe Biden is that as a kid, communicating was the thing that was physically most hard for him. He had this speech impediment, this stutter, that kids would make fun of him for constantly. And so that connects too to this kind of portrait of a guy who always feels like he's been underestimated. And so he comes into office. He's coming in after Donald Trump. The government has been wrecked. Our alliances with the Europeans and all of our old friends have been ruined by Donald Trump. He's rushing into the thick of a once-in-a-generation pandemic. The U.S. economy is hanging by a thread. And the task everybody thought in front of him was to return the country to normal. And lo and behold, this guy who always thinks that he's been underestimated decides that rather than returning the country to normal, and rather than doing these things around the edges, he's going to introduce some of the biggest pieces of social legislation actually the biggest pieces of social legislation in the history of the country. The first bill that he comes out of the gates with is called the American Rescue Plan, and it proposes $2 trillion worth of stimulus that had actually incredible effect. There was a period about 2 years ago when America had managed to cut its childhood poverty rate in half. It's one of these unsung accomplishments that just happened without anybody paying attention to it. And then, of course, we've not managed to sustain the levels of spending that we had, that he was able to pass out of the gate, and so that ended up disappearing. So he sets about doing this major thing, including the climate legislation that he ends up passing. And one of the things that's always at the top of his head, whether he chooses to articulate it or admit it or not, is that there is this contrast that he has with Barack Obama that runs through the way that he thinks through problems. So with the stimulus bill that I was just describing, the American Rescue Plan, when Obama came to office, he thought that Obama underspent on stimulus, and that so he was going to respond by going as big as possible. And so he arguably overspent, which had the effect of cutting childhood poverty, but probably also increasing inflation somewhat around the margins. And when it came to his social spending agenda, Obamacare was very much consistent with, I would say, the Reagan-Clinton era in terms of the way that it thought about the government, the way that it thought about the state. It was not government-provided health care like Bernie Sanders might have wanted. It was a solution that made its peace with markets, that relied on markets to regulate the healthcare industry with some subsidy from the government. And Biden has gone in a different way as it relates to his economic agenda, that Obama was somebody who was very lukewarm to trade unions, and Biden has been the first president to actually march on a picket line. He got behind the side of the Amazon workers in their struggle to unionize their plants. As it relates to free trade, Clinton, Obama kind of continued the Reagan-era approach of free trade, globalization. Biden has left in place the Trump-era tariffs on China. When it comes to the issue of dealing with the big tech companies in monopoly, Clinton and Obama were very sympathetic to those companies and tilted policy in that direction. Biden has rewritten the rules that govern how companies will end up merging. He's pursued big antitrust cases against those companies. He's gone in a different direction there. And then as you relates to these big pieces of legislation, which he's managed to get through the Senate, which is it's a 50-50 Senate. He's depending on Kamala Harris to cast the tying vote in most pieces of legislation. He's passed the infrastructure bill. He passed a bill supercharging the American semiconductor industry. Of course, he passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, I'm sorry, Europe, it comes at your expense, and it manages to supercharge the transition to green energy in the United States, and has succeeded in getting a lot of capital that was sitting on the sidelines to come rushing into this incredible renaissance of American manufacturing that nobody thought was possible. So at this big level, he's taken the state and its relationship to the market in a different direction. Now, Joe Biden would love to be appreciated for all of these accomplishments, given that he thinks that the world has constantly underestimated him. And the sad truth is that his approval ratings are in the toilet, and this guy who just wants to be loved is, in fact, at least in my country, a very unloved politician, judging by public opinion. And I'd say that there are a couple reasons why this is so. it's something that you can't dissociate from his age. When Americans look at Joe Biden, they see this guy who walks like an old man, who talks in a raspy sort of voice. One of the things that he's always had to contend with, and part of the reason, I should just say, when my book came out, there was an article in Politico, which is an insider publication in Washington, that said Joe Biden is boring, Joe Biden books are death in publishing. And I read that and I was like, oh my God, this is like, at least wait for me to be on sale for 1 week, for goodness sake. But it's like, there is this way in which people find him so familiar because he's been kicking around for so long that they cease to see the things that are actually interesting or significant about him. And so then you get to the fact that he is just, I call him the last politician, and there are two parts of what it means to be a politician. One part is it means governing, putting together coalitions, passing legislation, twisting arms, persuading legislators to come on board. And I think Biden has been pretty good at that. Then there's this other part of the job of politician, which is obviously the messaging part of the job. And for Biden considers himself an Irish storyteller. And when he thinks about politics, and if I'm preparing to come into a meeting with Joe Biden, he's going to spend a lot of time preparing to be able to tell you a story that's relevant to you. So if I'm the senator from Montana coming into his office, he's going to say, give me all the details about how this is going to affect people in Montana so I can tell a story to this guy. But when it comes to putting his agenda together into a larger narrative, he's not that great at it. And as a consequence, we're now sitting at this moment, we're headed into this election season. I can tell you a couple things. First, there are only very, very remote scenarios where Joe Biden is not the Democratic nominee, not the guy on the ballot come November. That he's running because he loves his job. Sitting and talking to foreign leaders all day long is his happy place. But secondly, it's very, very hard for people to recognize when they've reached that part in their career where it's time to hand things over to the younger person. We all have parents, we all have grandparents. We've seen what that's like in our own personal lives as people go through this transition. It's very hard. The people around Joe Biden are people who've worked with him for the entirety of their political careers. So in some sense, their political fortunes, their careers are tied up in Joe Biden's careers. So they're the last people who are going to walk into his office and say, you know what, put me out of a job next year. Don't run for president. And so he's committed himself to this course. I don't think he's going to change his vice president between now and the election. It's going to be this rematch, which I think is one of the reasons why Americans don't fully appreciate the gravity of what we're about to confront in November, because we've lived through this movie before, and it's all too familiar. And so the levels of outrage and anxiety that people are experiencing over this election seem to me that they're probably not as high as the level of anxiety that some of you in this room are feeling about our election, alas. I'm gonna just turn this over to the interview. I guess the last thing that I would say is I think there's something very superficial about the way that we think about age as it relates to this election. That the questions about Joe Biden's job performance are usually couched as questions about his mental acuity. And those are legitimate questions. I mean, I personally don't want to have an 86-year-old president because I don't think it's very prudent to take that kind of risk. But if you were to ask me in the present, does Joe Biden have the mental capacity to be president? I would say yes. Is he being led around on a leash by his staff? No, he's a micromanager. His staff is extremely deferential to him, deferential to a fault. He really has his hands involved in every little thing. He prepares like crazy for interviews, for meetings. He's actually pretty diligent about his homework, and so he takes papers home and he writes all over them and brings them back in the next morning. He's very determined not to look stupid like people. He doesn't want to be underestimated. That's the motive force. That's the driving thing. But to think about this election in terms of simply his mental acuity seems to me to miss the forest for the trees. That if we were going to talk about somebody who's got a mental acuity issue, I would say being an absolute lunatic is probably worse than being somebody who sometimes forgets a name. Thank you.
Sure, Mike. Thank you, Franklin. I was so happy when I first heard you were coming, because I really wanted to talk to you about the book you wrote 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Franklin wrote a book called How Soccer Explains the World, and that's one of my favorite non-fiction books of all time. Sorry, I have to briefly, because he mentioned during dinner that he's writing a sequel. It's 20 years old, but read the book. You look at globalization through the lens of soccer, and you hang out with ultra-nationalist hooligans in former Yugoslavia, and you write about Ajax as a Jewish club. But this is not a soccer audience.
Oh, wait, you sure? Do you want to test the proposition?
I would like to try, but this is the John Adams Institute. So we'll talk about politics, but read the book. It's 20 years old. He's writing a sequel, and it's a fantastic book about football.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you for the introduction. And you touched upon many of the things we'll discuss during the next hour, and then after that we'll have time for questions. I guess my first question is, because you said that he likes being president. Does Joe Biden like the job, the actual work, or does he like it even more, the fact that he's president? Because with Donald Trump, I had a sense that it might be the second, but with Biden.
Yeah, so I had a really interesting moment where I was going in to do an off-the-record interview with Joe Biden with a couple other journalists, and he was having lunch that day with Barack Obama. And I thought, oh, this is very sweet. Barack Obama's still hanging around the White House. This is a buddy movie. And Barack Obama came in. He walked into the hallway, into the waiting room. His tie was undone. It was way down. He looked so relaxed. And I turned to him and I said, "Is there anything about this place that you missed?" And he said, "No, nothing. I miss the people, but there's nothing about any of this that I miss." And I think. Then I went in and I saw Joe Biden. And the thing that is so striking about Joe Biden is, I'm sure he enjoys some of the trappings, but I think the part of it that he enjoys is, I said he loves talking to foreign leaders, and it's a real scheduling issue for him and his aides, that when he has calls with foreign leaders, you can't just assume that it's going to be over in 10 minutes, because he likes to think and do the psychological analysis beforehand about, what is this guy's political self-interest? What is the emotional baggage that he brings to this conversation? He likes to then sit around afterwards and talk about what happened in that conversation. And he likes to brag a little bit about how good a job he did bringing that leader around to his point of view. And, I just had the impression that when he talks about certain things, they're kind of boring to him, unfortunately, because for his campaign, he's talking about certain economic things, and he was like a little disorganized, I thought. But then he talks about foreign policy, or he could be talking about something like China. And it's interesting to see somebody whose mind kind of clicks at a certain moment where you're like, oh, they're focused right now, and they're talking about the thing that they most enjoy thinking about. And, just talking about China, Japan and South Korea have negotiated a rapprochement. This is what we're doing with Australia. This is how you combat the Belt and Road Initiative. This is how I'm going to be able to turn Modi. And I was like, he really, I think he enjoys his job. I think as it connects to these questions about underestimation, as it connects to having spent his life in some senses thinking through these issues, preparing for this sort of moment, and then actually getting to do it.
That also, he wants to be appreciated in that sense as well.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, because in the book, and we'll get to foreign policy later, but I think in your book you quote him telling his staff, basically explaining that diplomacy is quite easy and it's mostly about personal relationships, right?
Yeah, he likes to talk about how it's like family relations, but with people whose names are hard to pronounce.
That's one way to put it.
Somebody told me it was he once described it dealing with foreign leaders, especially ones who are harder to maneuver, as like dealing with your drunk uncle who you want to get to stop being such a pain in the ass. So yeah, there is that. At the end of the day, he's not somebody. Barack Obama is somebody who can intellectualize the world, who loved intellectualizing the world. Joe Biden is somebody who is a gritty person.
When you started out writing the book, and knowing now after having written the book, what was the main thing you were wrong about? Because he's been in Washington since 1973. Everybody has their opinion about Joe Biden. I'm sure you had yours.
I think I underestimated a lot of. I underestimated the things that he brought to the table. I mean, as I described, I was somebody who, I went to an Ivy League school. I come from. Barack Obama speaks in poetry. Joe Biden governs in prose. Poetry is beautiful. It's so attractive. I'm attracted to Obama's intellectualism, but I think that meant that I tended to underrate a lot of the very practical things that Joe Biden was just good at. He's very imperfect as a politician. As we are. And that's the thing is just the ultimate humanness of him is the thing that is both frustrating and admirable about him. There's nothing heroic about Joe Biden. Nobody has a picture of Joe Biden on their wall and it says, I want to grow up to be Joe Biden someday.
It must still puzzle him that since Obama was always accused or thought of being aloof, right? Academic, elite, arrogant in a sense, that somehow he connected more with at least part of the Democratic audience than Biden did, given his Scranton background, et cetera, et cetera.
There's something actually, so Barack Obama may be distant, but he has, his public persona is a very authentic expression of his self, and that when he speaks, there's Biden's problem, I think, is that we all know that he says the inappropriate thing, that he once called himself a gaffe machine. And it's why he goes to Poland and talks about why Vladimir Putin should be removed from power when he doesn't mean it, or means it but doesn't mean it.
They have to clean up a lot of, his staff has to clean up a lot of what he says.
Right. But so I think he understands, I'm president of the United States. If I say the wrong thing, it could get people killed, it could tank a market. And so he ends up, I think, not exposing himself nearly as much as he should. I think his aides probably on some level don't like having him out there because he just looks old. And so even if he gave a very good performance, they're worried that it would just remind people that, he's old. You don't need to be Bob Woodward to know that fact about the guy.
Bob Woodward is old.
Yeah, he is. He is. And so I think if I were, thank God I'm not advising Joe Biden because I would I should never give political advice. But if I were giving political advice, I would say, just let him talk. He'll make mistakes. But I think it would give people more confidence that he's the guy who's actually in control. Just to step back, one of the things that I think is propelling Trump is that you look at the world, you look at Ukraine, you look at Gaza, you look at all of these things that feel like inflation is a great example, that are spinning out of control. And then you see a guy who's old and doesn't seem to be in public that very often. Your assumption naturally is going to be he's not in control, that the chaos is the cause of him being an absentee guy, therefore bring in the strong man.
The relationship between Obama and Biden is interesting, and you touched on that as well. I'm just wondering, now that you talk about Obama more, I remember George W. Bush was always considered to wanting to impress his father and do better than his father. Does Biden really want to do better than Obama or be more popular? Is that something you believe is part of what triggers him, or is he more of an adult than that?
No, I would put it more generically than just a straight competition with Obama as father figure. I think that he's somebody who, it's not uncommon in public life. He's somebody who wants to be regarded as a great man. Sure. And he's had a lot of his life, people have told him, you're a great man. And so he wants to prove that. And one way that you do that is relative to historic benchmarks. And so, when you're vice president of the United States, the vice presidency is the premise for a comic show on HBO. It's a funny job. You're sitting around with this title that everybody assumes makes you extremely powerful, but you don't have a whole lot of autonomy. You don't actually have a whole lot of power. And so as he sat and watched Barack Obama, who would make fun of him, Barack Obama would tell a lot of jokes at Joe Biden's expense. When Joe Biden would start to go off on one of these monologues in a meeting, Obama would roll his eyes and everybody in the meeting would take it as a green light to make fun of Joe Biden. And of course Joe Biden understood that. And as he was watching, he would see these things, these decisions that get made, and he'd tell himself, well, if I were ever president, I would do it this way. And then lo and behold, he gets to be the president, and so he's doing it his way.
The fact that he was always, you said you underestimated Biden. He was always underestimated. He ran for president twice before, which was always a big failure. And then in 2020, he almost didn't make it to the Democratic nomination, but then in South Carolina he did, and eventually he became president. Is that proof of the fact that everybody always underestimated Biden, or was he just the man of the moment at the right time, and could he not have beaten anybody else but Trump?
Yeah. I think it's a bad argument to make that I've always been underestimated, and therefore I'm going to always prove people wrong, because I don't. You can see the the logical problems in that kind of circular thinking. I think that he was the right guy. I think that a lot of the members of his own party got out of step with even their own party. So Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were too far left for even most Democrats. And the gravitational pull of that primary was that everybody got pulled to the left, even Joe Biden, but Joe Biden got pulled less far to the left. And then in contrast, and in the appearance of this Democratic emergency, people said, "Okay, you're the guy for the moment."
When Biden came into office, and you can tell by his inaugural address, your book is called "The Last Politician" for a reason. As I said, he entered Washington in 1973 as a congressman, and that was a time, and in the 80s and the 90s, that time still existed, where Republicans and Democrats could get along. They disagreed, but there was some reaching across the aisle, etc. And did Biden, because it sounds naive in hindsight.
Were you alive in 1973?
Sorry? No, I wasn't. Thank you for noticing that. Were you?
I'm very well preserved.
No, I wasn't.
I wasn't either. I was not. I was born in 1974.
Okay. I was born in 1976, which makes me younger. But was he so...
We can have the audience vote on that.
Was he so naive that he actually thought, because he's been in office during the Obama years, which were very polarized, did he actually believe that he could change that dynamic in Washington, that he could work with Republicans, or did he know that he just had to say that in order to, to get things done?
Well, he's not that naive, and I think his best hope was that there was a faction within the Republican Party, especially in the Senate, where there were a couple of Republican senators who he'd worked with, who he knew, who he thought, at least on a few issues, I can find a way to meet them in the middle. And it doesn't mean...
Like Mitch McConnell or...
Not Mitch
others.
McConnell. I think it was more Susan Collins, who's a senator from Maine. I think it's the one more moderate than Mitch McConnell. I don't think he ever thought he could work with Mitch McConnell. I mean, I think he, on some broad level, that there would be moments of crisis, like Ukraine, where he actually... It's a good example. Mitch McConnell became Biden's biggest ally when it came to getting money through the Senate on Ukraine. And that happened because they have shared values, because they have a working relationship, because Biden knew never to make too big a deal of the fact that he was actually getting help from Republicans. But there was an interesting moment where Kevin McCarthy, who was the Speaker of the House, who was new, who really did look like he was beholden to the Trump wing of the Republican Party. And he gets elected Speaker of the House after this very contentious race where all of the Trump supporters do their best to try to block him. And he arrives at the moment that the debt ceiling needs to be raised. And during the Obama administration, the debt ceiling was a very, very big crisis that took the American economy to the brink of disaster. And Biden actually got called in by Obama to negotiate with Mitch McConnell then. So he invites McCarthy into the Oval Office, and he makes all the aides leave the room. And he tries to take the measure of McCarthy. And he's like, what? He goes through kind of whatever the algorithm is in his head where he tries to assess what's McCarthy's political interest? What are his bottom lines here? What is he really trying to get out of this negotiation? And so he sizes him up, and he's like, look, this guy is so insecure. What he really wants is to look like he is in command of the negotiation. So I'm going to let him go to the end of the White House driveway, and he can be the one who gives the readouts from the meeting. He can look like he's...
To the media.
To the media. He can look like he's in charge because he needs to look like he's the big man. And meanwhile, this idiot has just given me his bottom line. He says, like, the only thing that he cares about is not raising taxes. And so Biden figures out how he can give McCarthy what he needs and then prevent the bad outcome, which is the default on the debt. But also, he strangely managed to be able to get an expansion of benefits for these groups that McCarthy said he was going to cut. And so he basically was able to eat his lunch.
You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, and I think you say it in the book as well, as his biggest achievement.
Yeah.
Which is it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's basically a climate bill, right?
Yeah.
Why do you consider that his biggest achievement?
I mean, if you consider climate change to be the biggest long-term problem that we face as a planet, and the fact that, a couple things. One, that American inaction was a significant impediment to the rest of the world taking action. If you consider the fact that, at least as a matter of American national interest, being able to have a world-leading green energy industry where stuff is built in the United States actually matters considerably to the future of American competitiveness, American security. And like I said before, I think it represented this redirection of the role of the state in American life. And one of the things that I don't think Biden necessarily understood at the moment, maybe he understood it, but Joe Manchin, who was the senator who he was negotiating with, this very conservative senator, a Democrat from West Virginia, which is a coal state, who was really against doing anything that would end the fossil fuel industry, the Democrats had to negotiate with Joe Manchin, and they negotiated all of these tax credits, and it gets, at the end of a process of writing legislation, it goes to the equivalent of the government accountants, and they say, all right, you said it's going to spend this much money and bring in this much revenue. Here's what we independently think. And so the bill got sent to them, and they said, all right, you're going to spend $379 billion on green energy over the course of the next 10 years. But the thing that Manchin didn't understand and the government accountants missed is that there actually was no cap on the amount of money that they could spend. They were estimating that if things went as we expected, the government will spend this amount of money. But as it turns out, the appetite to build factories that are producing solar cells and wind and in batteries in the United States is almost bottomless. And so if the US government is going to just keep shoveling money out the door to subsidize this, then people will keep coming. And I think it's going to be well over $1 trillion that the American government, the American taxpayers, are going to spend on this transition. And it's just as if one other digression here is that it's so interesting. You see the way in which a decision like that ends up compounding, because one thing we never talked about, or at least I never talked about in everyday life before the pandemic, was supply chains. But you see the way in which complicated supply chains work. And so if you're going to try to get a complicated supply chain to locate in Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, you need there to be these big, shocking events where one plant locates there and another plant locates there, and then even the people who aren't getting that much money decide, okay, I need to be here because it's so much cheaper for me to be building this thing closer to these other things, and so you end up getting this virtuous snowball effect.
So the climate bill was there, the infrastructure bill. You just mentioned during your introduction how Biden was basically the first president to stand with unions or in the picket line. We'll get to talk about abortion later, which has been an important topic in the previous midterms and perhaps in this elections. Those are all issues that are very important to the left. And when it comes to unions or infrastructure, it could also be of interest to the Trump voter, or at least to the independent voter. Why doesn't Biden, he has things he can brag about, but he doesn't get the credits. And you just spoke about it, and his age may be one of those things, but the Democrats seem to have a messaging problem. What are the other reasons for him not being able to campaign on what he achieved?
So there's so many problems. One problem is that unemployment has been extremely low. It's historically low. It's incredible how many jobs have been added, but you have inflation that's happening simultaneously. And so even if the economy is growing, people are still feeling pain. They're still paying higher interest rates on their credit card bills because that's the medicine that we use to get inflation down. They're still unable to buy a home because mortgage rates are so high. And they still remember that 2 years ago, a gallon of milk or a liter of milk cost $1.50 less. And they're still pissed every time they walk into the supermarket. So you have that. You have the pandemic, where I think one of the other things that was a real achievement was that they came into office, and even though the Trump administration had done Operation Warp Speed and given all these subsidies to Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, as it turned out, the first vaccine that was viable and that ended up being the real workhorse vaccine of the early pandemic was Pfizer's, and they didn't take money from the Trump administration because they didn't want to be micromanaged by Trump, and they had terrible relations with, and so they needed to ramp up Pfizer's production very quickly. They needed to come up with a plan to get shots in arms. But so they probably, there was a study in a Yale journal about how the vaccine rollout probably saved 1 million lives. But everybody still felt miserable because COVID never went away and all the restrictions managed to linger way too long, which is partly Biden's fault. And so they were never able to crow about the economy. They were never able to take a victory lap over the pandemic. And then with the left, you promise, he promised to be Franklin Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson, and he ended up producing a great climate bill. It all looks small relative to what people thought that they might be able to get.
He built those expectations being the new FDR, and perhaps he shouldn't have, or at least people had those expectations.
Well, he built those expectations by proposing legislation that was that big, and it was that close to getting passed through Congress. So Joe Manchin, who I already described, so when you have a 50-50 Senate, Kamala Harris tying vote, that means that any senator can decide to become the most important person in America to either kill or let live the president's big agenda. And Manchin was somebody who very much enjoyed playing that role. And Joe Biden, I told you, one of the ways in which his insecurities manifested itself was he likes real estate. The guy bought this big house in Delaware, and it became his do-it-yourself project. And so he would be in the up to his knees in mud. He would be hammering away at, trying to restore this house. It's a thing that he's incredibly proud of because it shows the world that Scranton Joe that kid really made it. But he hasn't used it as a political set before. And so Manchin was on the brink of signing on for more than $2 trillion in spending. We've gotten universal pre-kindergarten, daycare, elder care, all of these incredible things. And Biden brings him to his house. It's the first time he's brought anybody to his house. Gives the guy a 2-hour tour. Shows him every bathroom. And then they sit down and they go through and they go over all the last agenda items. And Biden's wife is a teacher. She really wanted there to be universal, free community college. And so Biden's like, come on, man, you got to give this to me. And Manchin says, no, I can't give this to you. They work through all these details. It still wasn't there in order to be able to write a bill, but they were so close. And at the end of it, Joe Manchin shakes his hand. And he says, I want to get this done for you, Mr. President. And so Joe Biden thinks, my God, he came into my house and shook my hand. That, how could this guy ever betray me?
Well,
2 months later, there was a press release that was written that came out. Manchin comes to visit the White House. It's just before Christmas. And Biden people are like, we need to put out a press release saying this. We're still talking to Joe Manchin so that everybody doesn't freak out in the Democratic Party. And they show Manchin the press release, and Manchin freaks out. And he says, oh my God, you putting out a press release saying you're still negotiating with me? These protesters are going to come to my house during Christmas. They're going to make my life miserable. It's very threatening to me and my family. And Biden people are like, what are you talking about? Like, we are still only negotiating with you. We can't lie. And so they put out the press release anyways, and Manchin goes absolutely berserk and tells them, I'm killing this bill, and they still don't really believe him. And then he goes on Fox News on Sunday and says, you know what, I'm pulling my support from this bill. And they gave Biden a heads up personally about an hour before this happens, and he's frantically trying to call this guy on his cell phone. He's not picking up his cell phone. He left this very almost pathetic message being like, Joe, you can't do this to me right before Christmas. And it died. And it looked like his whole presidency was going to come crashing down because he failed really to take the accurate measure of this guy. And then he has to, just to make a long story short, so he then makes a decision, I can't negotiate with him anymore because every time I talk to him, it's just increasing the pressure. This thing needs to happen in quiet. So he assigns Chuck Schumer, who's the head of the Senate Democrats, to negotiate with him. And the fact that the Inflation Reduction Bill passed at all was this incredible secret. Only 10 people in Washington understood that this extremely important bill was about to pass. And when it ended up coming out, it took Washington by complete surprise. And I thought complete surprises were impossible.
But I guess the whole episode with Manchin shows that Biden overestimated his own capabilities and relied on personal relationships for too long, which in Washington nowadays hardly have any meaning anymore.
Yeah. I'm not sure there was any choice other than doing that.
Sure.
Because he wasn't going to, you can't make somebody do something that they don't want to do.
Right.
And this is kind of a fallacy, I think, in politics. Like we could turn to foreign policy, but I was just thinking about Bibi Netanyahu, and it's like there's this fallacy, like if only Biden picked up the phone call and told Netanyahu to stop killing civilians in Gaza, then he would stop killing civilians in Gaza. He hasn't tried to do that, so I don't know what the outcome would be, but I imagine that, at least for Netanyahu, his own political interests, his own public, et cetera, all these things are propelling him to do what he's going to do. Joe Manchin did what he wanted to do because he's a conservative Democrat from a coal state who hates social spending. So you can't say, I'm kicking you out of the party if you don't do this, because that maybe would be the best thing that would ever happen to the guy.
Right.
I think for Netanyahu, if you said, I'm telling you to stop, I'm the American president, Netanyahu would say, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me with my political coalition. They're going to stay with me because they love me being tough to the American president.
We'll talk about Israel later on, because foreign policy I'm curious to hear what you think, but it seems like something that may really hurt him during the elections. But just to go back a bit, you mentioned Kamala Harris, his vice president, and I'm wondering, and you write about it in the book a bit, about their relationship. When Biden was vice president to Obama, he filled a gap in Obama's resume, right? He was the foreign policy guy, blah, blah, blah. So Biden had a function.
Yeah.
If you've been in politics as long as Biden has, maybe it's hard to find the same kind of role for Harris. And now everybody's asking, where is Harris? We don't see her. How is the relationship between the two?
Right. So implied in your question is the way in which he brings the baggage from his own time as vice president to the job, which I think is real. I think that he accords her a great deal of very formal respect that he feels like he was denied by Barack Obama. For instance, he hated how Obama called him my vice president. And so he refers to Harris all the time as the vice president, which he thinks doesn't make her sound like, a pet poodle or something. But the problem is that she hasn't had the space to be able to carve out a political identity, a set of policy issues.
Because he did not grant her the space.
Well, he went through kind of a hazing ritual. Obama assigned him to go to Central America to deal with the corrupt governments in Central America, to try to get them to stop letting their economically downtrodden people migrate to. It's a worse job. And he had it, so he's like, I'm giving this to you, just like Obama gave this to me.
He sent Harris to the border, basically.
Well, unfortunately, he didn't do that. He sent her to Central America, and everybody assumed she was in charge of the border when he actually hadn't given her that formal responsibility. And so there's this famous moment where she's being interviewed, and they say, why haven't you been to the border? And she says, well, we've been to the border. And she says, I haven't been to Europe either. It's like, okay. But I think that the thing that was striking to me was the way in which there are certain parallels between Obama and Harris that I've described in great detail. Biden's insecurities, but Harris, like Biden, is somebody who spends a lot of time preparing, that she's a prosecutor, a former prosecutor, and when she goes into a policy briefing, she's preparing as if she's going into a trial. So sometimes she'll even stage mock debates between her aides. You take the role of pro, arguing for leaving Afghanistan. You take the role arguing against, and I'm just going to sit back and ask you questions while you go through this Socratic exercise. And if you're telling her, you need to go to this meeting about Northern Ireland, she'll actually read the book about it. But there's a real cost to that kind of over preparation. First is it kills your schedule, and second of all, your staff end up hating you because they feel like you're engaging in a lot of very trivial minutia that really shouldn't be your responsibility. And then thirdly, because she knows that she is a historic first, I think she talks about a lot how she's worried that if she makes a mistake, the press is going to give her an especially hard time, and it's going to have consequences that are going to echo through the generations, that it's going to hurt the next black woman who's coming through. And as a result, she's very risk averse. I mean, I'm just telling you what she says to explain her risk aversion. And then I think with the over preparation and the fear of making a mistake, when she gives answers to questions, they can be very hard to follow. They zigzag, and because she gets really defensive in the course of an interview, and you can just see her mind working as she's like, oh, there's a mistake I need to avoid there. I'm going this way. Oh, crap, I've just talked myself into this cul-de-sac.
Let's slowly move towards the upcoming elections. But before that, the midterms in 2022. Everybody expected, because that's usually how it goes, the party in office loses the midterms. The Democrats lost in the House, but not as much as they expected. They held on to the Senate. Was that because of Biden or in spite of Biden?
Both. It's because, it's in spite of the fact that economic conditions were really not very good, in spite of the fact that he passes an infrastructure bill. A lot of the public bizarrely credits the bill to Donald Trump. It's the weirdest thing. Donald Trump forever, there was a joke. Trump would say, this is infrastructure week. We're going to pass an infrastructure bill. And he never...
Another scandal hit.
Yeah, and he never proposed an infrastructure bill. But Biden actually gets it done, and people say, oh, great job, Donald Trump. But the thing that he did that was shrewd in those midterm elections is people said, you know what, you have to take crime, the economy, head on and talk to them and and he said, no, I'm going to make this election about Donald Trump. It's going to be about democracy versus authoritarianism. And that was the neat formula that he had. And it turned out, I think that was the right formula. That was the effective argument to make.
And he'll probably make the same argument. I want to look at the first clip, because the 2022 elections were, yes, about democracy, I guess also about abortion, right?
Very much so.
It was right after the Dobbs decision, in which the Supreme Court, they canceled Roe v. Wade, the federal protection of abortion. So abortion was the other big theme. And it seems like the Democrats really want to run on that again. So let's look at the first clip.
I'm an OBGYN in Texas and a mother of 3 wonderful children. Having this beautiful, messy, chaotic, but wonderful family, it's the joy of my life. I never thought that I would need an abortion for a planned pregnancy, but I did. 2 years ago, I became pregnant with a baby I desperately wanted. At a routine ultrasound, I learned that the fetus would have a fatal condition and that there was absolutely no chance of survival. In Texas, you are forced to carry that pregnancy, and that is because of Donald Trump overturning Roe v. Wade. The choice was completely taken away. I was to continue my pregnancy, putting my life at risk. It's every woman's worst nightmare, and it was absolutely unbearable. We need leaders that will protect our rights and not take them away. And that's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
I'm an OBGYN.
So I'm showing this for 2 reasons. I'll get to the second in a bit. The first reason being Joe Biden is a Catholic. And when it comes to social issues, he's often been ahead of the pack. I remember him being a proponent of gay marriage before Obama did. But abortion as a Catholic may be different for him. Is that something, I mean, he's obviously campaigning on it, but is that something he's struggled with?
Yeah, very much so. So it was people could see the Dobbs decision coming. It was when the Supreme Court took up the issue, it was possible to imagine that they would overturn Roe versus Wade, and then
it leaked.
And then the Supreme Court, for the first time in its history, actually leaked a decision. So it was obvious, it was clear as day what was coming. And Biden met with his top advisors. There was a task force that was assigned to come up with a set of policies that he could announce the day that the Dobbs decision was announced, counteracting the Dobbs decision, having the political effect that was desired, reassuring women that Biden was going to fight for them. And Biden heard these proposals, and it just made him angry. And it's his mind always would go to the question of, how are these groups, women's groups especially, trying to trick me? And he had a very large degree of suspicion of them that went back to the famous Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, where he ended up taking a lot of the blame, justifiably, for the way in which the Senate was very gentle on Clarence Thomas for sexually harassing Anita Hill. And so there was all this pain that he brought to that, and there was his Catholicism, which is really very real. And there are a lot of liberal Catholics like Nancy Pelosi and John Kerry who just exist in a state of kind of perpetual agony over these issues, because if you grow up and you really believe in your church, and then the leaders of your church are saying you're a bad Catholic all the time, it nags at you. And so I think it nagged at him to some extent, no, to a large extent. And so the Dobbs decision is passed. He has this meeting. It ends very badly. He's very angry. The Dobbs decision happens. He has a speech that's been prepared, and he tries to edit the speech so that it's more about the consequences for privacy than about women's health and women's rights. And his advisors are like, no, you can't do that. You're stuck. I mean, he was processing it in part, just privacy was a more comfortable issue for him than abortion. And they got him to change the language back to, saying mostly the right things about abortion. But then he goes out and gives this speech, and everybody was looking at him and they're like, this is a big deal that's just happened. And that was kind of a lame, tone deaf, inert speech. Where was the passion? And then for 2 weeks, there was this struggle to get him to actually move on the choice issues. And they didn't know how to do it. They were like, do we get his sister to talk to him? Do we go to his granddaughters and get them to talk to him? And in the end, I think the thing that hit him was the criticism that he got, but also if you come from the 1980s and you remember what it was like to deal with moderate Republicans and what the Ronald Reagan Republican Party was like, it's hard to process sometimes the sheer radicalism of what the modern conservative movement has become. And Dobbs is an extremely radical decision. And it struck him, there was a 10-year-old girl who had to have an abortion in Indianapolis. And her doctor was prosecuted for doing this. And that to him made it much more simple. For him, it became a morality tale about bullies and helpless victims, and that allowed him to get to the place where
he had a story. You were saying he always needed a story. He found his story.
He found his story, and I think his aides kept telling him about the political importance of speaking to women on this issue, and that, I mean, it was ironically this thing that he struggled with enormously was the thing that probably saved his bacon in the 2022 midterms.
So we'll have him talk about abortion a lot this year. We'll have him talk about democracy and the Capitol riot and how Trump is a disaster for democracy, etc. Do you think the Democrats have basically almost given up on campaigning on what Biden has achieved, and they mostly just want to talk about Trump more than anything else?
I don't think they can give that up. I mean, I think those are, you've talked about two potent messages. I think, one thing they could argue, and I don't know if the public will buy it, but he's argued this in certain places, that Trump calls himself a populist, but he's a total phony populist because he never actually, his policies actually did a lot to hurt working people. And he could say, he's a phony populist, I delivered on this agenda. And he could talk about the way in which there are financial interests that are backing Donald Trump. He has to make some version of that argument. One problem Joe Biden has as a political messenger is that he's not a very adversarial person. He doesn't like to construct us versus them narratives. He didn't even like to talk about Donald Trump by name for a very long time.
You mentioned that in the book.
He would call him the former guy. Yeah, he was like Voldemort in Harry Potter.
Time flies, and I want to give the audience the chance to pose questions as well. Two more things. You devote a lot of time in the book to foreign affairs, especially the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Also about his, the Afghanistan withdrawal, basically, that's the end of the honeymoon for him, right? The approval ratings go down.
And they never come back up.
You bring up the Ukraine war and his relationship with Zelensky, which is very interesting. But let's talk about that other war briefly, and you brought up Netanyahu earlier. I spent quite some time over the past months talking to young voters in the US, and many of them are so upset because there's really a generational shift, and they're so upset with Obama's Israel policy, pro-Israel policy, and they sympathize much more with the Palestinians, that it may really hurt Biden, it seems, especially in a narrow election in states like Michigan or, well, anywhere with a young or Arab population. Is that something that really worries, you think, the Biden White House or the campaign, that the war in Gaza may bring Trump back into office?
I think it should worry them. I mean, I don't know what I'm not proposing a solution, but I think that as a matter of sheer politics, he was suffering from lack of enthusiasm among younger voters and among black voters and among Hispanic voters. And I think this has kind of compounded those sorts of issues. When he was endorsed by the United Auto Workers the other day, who were very grateful the role that he played in helping them get their new agreement with the big automakers. And it was this triumphant moment for him. And he got heckled by people who were saying Free Palestine, and that happens to him at almost every event. And then you do have state of Michigan, a crucial state that has a sizable Arab American population. And I think you could argue, it seems likely that at the very least there's going to be dampened enthusiasm for Biden. So just to be clear, young people are not going to vote for Trump. They're going to either stay home or vote for a third party candidate in all likelihood.
Green Party or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. The final clip I want to show is actually the fourth clip, so I'm mixing up the
I had no idea we were so multimedia here.
Yeah, no, I know, it's amazing. It's a clip that Fox News and other conservative networks will keep showing. If you're a Biden fan, you know, it's not something you really like to watch, but it's about his age and his gaffies. So let's take a look at the fourth clip.
That's why I and so damn many other people I grew up have cancer. And why for the longest time, Delaware had the highest cancer rate in the nation. America is a nation that can be defined in a single word. I was going to excuse me.
Mr. Haney?
We're doing it for the first time now in the 21st century, going into the 20th, from the 20th century going into the second quarter of the 21st century. that we'd say 12 years is enough? I think 12 years is enough going into 20, 30, 40, 50? The rebuilding of Syria, of Libya, they're there. And I want to thank the Prime Minister for Colombia's leadership and the ASEAN chair.
So this is just a clip that I found online, but it has millions of views, and I know that the other guy is somebody who says that windmills cause cancer, but this happens as well, and I'm just wondering, this is really hard to counter, because as you mentioned, he is old, and maybe behind the scenes he's very sharp, and that's all possible, but you win campaigns on television, and this is what people see. So how is this an issue you can tackle as a campaign, except for not, keeping him inside the basement, which is not possible. Even though the previous election, actually the previous election, the COVID election, you didn't see much of him and he won, but this time will be different.
This is the problem. I'm not a political consultant.
No, but
I don't know. I don't actually know how you counter that other than exposing him all the time, which inevitably is going to lead to moments like that. Because if I talked all the time, I don't walk funny. I don't walk. He broke his. He had a biking accident, so he walks funny. I don't. I may look younger than you, but if somebody looked at like the transcript here of this speech, if I was talking for all day long, I would make some mistakes that were the result of being very old, and then I'd make some mistakes because, I just make mistakes in the course of talking. And if you're confirming something that people already believe, you're screwed. I really don't see how you get out of it. And it really is, like I said before, the primary. Any American election is going to be divided pretty close to 50-50 because people have their minds made up. Right. But if you're looking for a reason to vote for Donald Trump because you think it's socially, morally, on some level, irresponsible to vote for Donald Trump,
this is your excuse.
This becomes your excuse.
And with that, I think we have time for 4 or 5 questions, maybe 6, depending on the length of the questions. There's a microphone in the middle. What if 4 or 5 people line up? Because if 20 people line up, I'll be disappointing half of you. Anybody, go ahead.
Is this working? Yeah. I was wondering Biden's appeasement policy toward Iran, that he's perceived as weak. Do you agree to that? Is it a wise policy to try to appease Iran, or is it counterproductive?
So I think there were some assumptions embedded in that question. But the way that I think about, the way that seriously I think about Iran is the way that I think about China. It's the way that, to some extent, I think about Russia too, which is that we live in this powder keg of a world where everything is about to explode, and the U.S. has this tremendous presence in the Middle East, and Iran has an incredible number of proxies in the region. And I think that he has to find a way to both apply pressure on these countries in order to contain them, but there's also incredible dangers that come with pushing too hard. So, in my opinion, I think that I think you have to walk a very uncomfortable line that satisfies very few people on some of these issues.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, Trump has really left a legacy on the Republican Party. There's a whole school of young Republican leaders who are following his political style, and he's really transformed the party. Is there a Do you see a Biden equivalent of that within the Democratic Party? Is there like a young school of leaders who want to be like him, or is he really the last politician in that regard? Or framed differently, what's going to happen with the party if Biden's gone?
So it's inevitable. In the long run, in the long term, what did Keynes say? The clock ticks, and there's certain things that nature means are unavoidable. And one of those things is that there will be a generational turnover in the Democratic Party.
You're saying he's going to die eventually.
Thank you, Elko.
You're right. What is this, clickbait? What I'm saying is that there actually are impressive leaders in the Democratic Party who, if he didn't run this time, plausibly could step forward and could be plausible national leaders. They're not. Some of them are very much actually in his style. So, and they exist at the state level. So there's Gretchen Whitmer, who's the governor of Michigan, who's somebody who I think would be, I would say, oh, she's kind of a Biden Democrat. Like, she's somebody who manages to steer like a middle course on a lot of the cultural issues that are so divisive within the party. The establishment is comfortable with her, and she can bring along enough of the left. There's the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, who's like this. There are plenty of senators who would fit the mold. The problem is when you don't have a primary, there's no opportunity to actually test those candidates to see how they would perform. We don't know how that test would shake out, because the 2016 primary between Clinton and Bernie Sanders, I was about to have a Joe Biden moment there, it was really disastrous for the Democratic Party in the 2016 election, where a lot of Sanders voters either were so pissed off they stayed home or they voted for Trump even. We don't know what that primary would look like, but it's not like there's no alternative out there.
Obama was always blamed for not caring enough about the guy or the girl after him, not looking enough to the next generation. Is Biden, is this something that Biden is preoccupied with? Is he looking at the future of the party past his own re-election or not re-election?
I think that he's dealing with wars and re-elections. I don't think he's tending to the long. To be fair to Biden, I think that he actually does tend to the long term in a way that few presidents have, because most of his policies actually don't matter tomorrow. The Inflation Reduction Act isn't employing people who are going to become Biden voters tomorrow, or the infrastructure bill spending is going to happen over the course of 10 years. Et cetera, et cetera.
Which is one of his problems, because you won't see a bridge built in your backyard until
Thank you.
Trump has been reelected. Go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. I've enjoyed it. Rumor has it, and you know how rumors are, that Barack Obama is working Joe Scranton behind the scenes in favor of his wife, Michelle, to run. Do you think that even if she chooses to accept that position, which she historically doesn't like to accept, that even if she were to accept that position, would Joe accept the step to step down, or would he suffer from Queen Victoria syndrome and say, "I'm the only man who can do it"?
I'm not going to say any scenario is impossible, but I would be beyond shocked if that happened, and for. Not just because I think it would be hard to imagine him stepping aside in that situation, but I think Michelle Obama hates politics. Like, Joe Biden loves politics. Michelle Obama hates politics. She has, as far as I can tell, zero interest in inserting herself into that position, returning to Washington, returning to the White House. I don't see it.
Fox News would love to run against Michelle Obama also.
Well, that's the other thing, is that it sounds appealing on paper, probably to a lot of people here, but we don't know. We really don't know.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, one serious question and a very brief, maybe fun question. The first would be, there are two people that haven't been addressed yet. I'm sure they are addressed in the book. I'm just curious how you think they will influence, well, Biden's chance of becoming or staying on as president in the coming election. And the one is his son, Hunter. Obviously, a lot of controversy there. And the other one would be, and it has been alluded to, is Robert Kennedy. And his shot at maybe being a dark horse coming from the left or the right and taking votes from...
Sorry, I missed who?
Robert Kennedy.
Oh, Robert Kennedy, yeah.
So those two people, what are your thoughts and how can they influence Biden?
Yeah, thank you. So the Hunter Biden-Joe Biden relationship is so complicated. And it was actually one of the things that I think probably gave him second thoughts about running for president again, because he thinks his son is getting prosecuted unfairly for something that, you know, nobody really gets prosecuted for. I mean, we mince words. Like, his son is not an appealing figure, and his son was engaged in very scuzzy business practices, which happen to be very standard business practices in Washington. Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of people who profit off of political connections in Washington working for very sketchy foreign concerns. So I'm not here to defend Hunter Biden in any way, shape, or form. I think that Hunter Biden is the last person to survive from the car crash that killed Biden's wife and Biden's daughter. Biden's first son, his older son, Beau, was the son who he loved the most in the world, who he thought was going to be. The question before was about younger Democrats. I think Joe Biden thought Hunter Biden was the younger Democrat who would follow in his footsteps. Beau, sorry. See, I told you. I don't want to watch the Fox News clip of this event. Franklin Foer has dementia. He's too old for the job. But Beau Biden, it passed away from brain cancer, and it was totally crushing to Joe Biden. It's the big reason he didn't run in 2016. I think he was just not emotionally up to the job. But then you have this relationship where Hunter. Sorry, now it's in my head. It's a Joe Biden spiral. Hunter Biden knows that Joe Biden was crushed because his favorite son died. Hunter Biden also knows that his scuzzy business dealings are plausibly hurting his father's reelection. So he feels angry and guilty about that. Joe Biden feels angry and guilty over the fact that his son is being prosecuted for these crimes because he's president of the United States, which means that this is an issue where he's not able to think politically or strategically at all. And whether it matters in the election, I think it matters because Trump's own ethics are a primary line of attack, and anything that Trump can do to muddy the waters there is a net positive for him. Robert Kennedy, he's disappeared a little bit from news over the course of the last couple months, and I honestly struggle to figure out which way he would cut in an election, because I could see him taking Trump voters, I can see him taking Biden voters. He's at this intersection between the far left and the far right that reflects this kind of just general anti-vax, populist, anti-woke sentiment. And
he does.
I think there could be third and fourth. I mean, it's also hard to put a third party into plausible motion. He's not going to be in any debates. I don't know what his ballot access is like in every state. So I think it's one of these things where you can overstate the implication. But we've been here before, right? We saw how Ralph Nader affected the 2000 election. We saw how Jill Stein affected the 2016 election. We saw how the Libertarian Party maybe affected the 2020 election.
Thank you.
There was a fun question.
Yeah, I thought there was a fun question too. No?
Well, thank you for the conversation tonight. We haven't discussed immigration and the border as much as I thought we would. I was reading today that American people trust the Republicans much better with immigration. And also I was reading that there's an influx of immigration at the border and that it could cost the election to Biden. So what do you think about that? And do you think that he's going to firm up his stance on immigration?
It really does connect to what I was saying before about the sense of chaos as much as anything, that you see these images of all of these people, these migrants amassed at the border, and you're just like, I think voters ask, like, what's happening? Why is this happening? They assume that it somehow must be his fault. And on some level, it probably is his fault. I mean, I'm not saying that he sat and said, what would be great is if a great tide of humanity came seeking to migrate to the United States. I think by making it clear that he was changing Trump's policies, and also by creating a very tight labor market, it was inevitable that people would come to the United States. Joe Biden, it's much like abortion, I would say. It's an issue where he doesn't like it. It makes him angry. He feels like he's torn between his own political instincts and the base of his party. And he feels like the base of the party is probably sitting in bureaucratic offices, coming up with plans to take him much further to the left than he's comfortable going. And then, I don't know if you've been following over the course of the last couple of weeks, there's been a negotiation happening to try to get the Ukraine money, where there was a trade in exchange for funding the war in Ukraine and funding the war in Israel. He was willing to give the Republicans much tighter border security measures, and the devil's very much in the details there about what he gives, because some things would change. The worry is that certain changes that could get made would be exploited by Donald Trump when he gets into office to really do, very inhumane, very restrictive things. But Biden was willing to make this deal. There were Republicans who were willing to make a deal. And then Donald Trump comes in and says, I know that this might actually help deal with the problem at the border, but it would also hurt my reelection, so don't pass this compromise. And in another world, you would think, oh, this would really hurt Donald Trump. He's saying he's being obstructionist on this issue that Americans say that they care most about. He's undermining trust in the Republican Party. But the truth is that that's a very insider sort of way of understanding the issue. And American media is so crumbled in terms of its ability to connect with larger audiences. I think that type of message is just going to pass most people by.
Thank you. And you're right. We could have spoken about the border more, or about Ukraine, or many other issues, but time is almost up. I'm just wondering, because we have two of the most unpopular presidential candidates ever running against each other, most likely in November. And perhaps it's fair to say that Trump would lose to any Democrat except perhaps Joe Biden, and the other way around, or not.
I beg to differ.
Please, why?
Because there are a lot of Democrats who just aren't necessarily attractive to the majority of American voters. Like if Bernie Sanders was running against Donald Trump, I couldn't tell you that Bernie Sanders would beat Donald Trump. I couldn't tell you that Elizabeth Warren would beat Donald Trump. I couldn't tell you that Gavin Newsom would beat Donald Trump. Gavin Newsom is so attractive and
governor of California.
Yeah, is, such a good speaker, but his state has a crime epidemic. It has a terrible homelessness problem. It's got all sorts of. I just can't tell you that would be the case.
So who then, if you had $1 million, or maybe you do, I don't know, who would you place your bet on?
Well, I'm not going to dodge the issue, even though it's a.
You knew you were getting this question.
I know, and I usually would have preempted and say, I don't know who's going to win, so don't ask me this question. But
it's too late.
It's too late. So I'm telling you, go place the money on the other guy, because I don't trust my own opinion. But if you put a gun to my head. And you said I could win $1 million? Is that what you said, if I get this right?
Well, first of all, you're a journalist and you live in one of the most expensive cities in America, so I know you don't have $1 million.
That's true.
But if you did have $1 million.
Yeah. I would say that I would give Joe Biden a slight edge, ever so slight. It's like a 52%, 48% in my head edge.
And based on what the most? What's the main argument for that?
So this is not necessarily a rational argument. It's really just that at the end of the day, I feel like when people had maximum exposure to Donald Trump at the end, which they will have by the end of this campaign, they tend they're decent people who tend to recoil from Donald Trump. And right now, Donald Trump is sitting in a courtroom. Donald Trump is basically, I know you have this policy here of being very careful about which right-wing politicians you interview and how much airtime you give them. That's essentially, no.
Well, first of all, I don't think that's the case. Second of all, if it was the case, it didn't really help.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it didn't help. It did not help. It did not help here. It distinctly did not help in the United. Trump has been deplatformed in lots of ways from mainstream media. And I think it means that people tend to forget how mean he is. So that's I don't think you can hang a whole lot on that. And I certainly would not rush to the betting parlor based on what I just told you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franklin, for opening our eyes to, I think, a number of aspects of Joe Biden that we tend to forget because it is easy to overlook him. And I think a lot of us have. And I think your book really helps us realize how significant this presidency is, and not just because of what is coming in November. So thank you for coming here to talk to us, and thank you for writing this book. What's upcoming at the John Adams? Our next event is on February 15 with the Harvard historian Taya Miles, winner of the National Book Award last year for her book, All That She Carried. It's about a bag, a simple cloth bag that is in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution. And one of the special parts of this evening will be a reflection on this bag by the director of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch, who was with us a few months ago in collaboration with the U.S. Embassy. And the event will be held in the Bijlmer Park Theater, which is, we've tried to get in there for quite some time, but they're very busy. And I'm glad that with Taya Miles, we're able to do an event in the Bijlmer, which, as you may know, is also part of Amsterdam, although I don't know how often you actually get there. It's a wonderful story. Taya Miles herself is a black woman, as I said, a historian at Harvard, and she's written the story of this bag in which the daughter of an enslaved woman takes this bag as she tries to escape from slavery. And it's really an allegory for her life. And of course, another big theme this year is, like this evening, the elections. So if you like this one, you might like the next one, the Google algorithm. On March 5th, we are giving the floor to Kenneth Monusama on Super Tuesday, March 5th, a legal scholar and also the maker of the podcast Amerikaanse Toestanden, who will be writing about his book Democratie van het Wilde Westen, published by Bots Uitgevers. And yes, you hear it right, it's a book in Dutch. Franklin's book has not been translated into Dutch, and Kenneth Monusama's book has not been translated into English. It's not often that we give the floor to Dutch speakers. As a matter of fact, I don't know if it's ever happened, but we're going to do it this time because we think he really has something to tell us about the vulnerabilities of American democracy as we look toward the events that will be unrolling in November. Franklin will be signing books. Let's all go have a drink, buy the book, get a signature, talk to someone you don't know. I think that's always a good starting point for an evening like this, because even though polarization is so huge also in our country, I think looking at all of you here this evening, there is a lot that binds us. Thank you for joining us.